3 years ago, Master Sergeant Victoria Vic Castellanos was voted out of the Army's most elite special operations unit by the very teammates who once called her family. Tonight, those same soldiers would discover she was the only person on Earth who could save their lives. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The fluorescent lights in the Riverside Community College security office buzzed with the persistent hum that had become the soundtrack to Victoria's exile from the life she once knew. She adjusted her ill-fitting uniform shirt and checked the bank of monitors showing empty hallways, vacant parking lots, and the kind of profound stillness that only existed in small Oregon towns after midnight. The badge clipped to her breast pocket read, V. Castellanos, Night Security, a title that carried about as much weight as tissue paper in a hurricane. For most people, working the graveyard shift at a community college would be the definition of career purgatory. A place where ambition came to die, where former somebodies became invisible nobodies, where the most exciting part of the night might be telling a stoned teenager to move along from the student center steps. But Victoria had learned that invisibility could be its own kind of armor, and sometimes the best place to hide was in plain sight. She poured coffee from a thermos that had seen better decades, the liquid black enough to strip paint and strong enough to wake the dead. The coffee was terrible, but it was consistent, and after 3 years of nights like this, consistency had become a luxury she didn't take for granted. Outside, the Pacific Northwest drizzle painted everything in shades of gray, turning the college campus into a watercolor study in solitude. The radio on her desk crackled, occasionally with the routine check-ins from the 2 other guards on duty. Frank Morrison covered the north buildings, a retired postal worker who treated security rounds like a leisurely evening stroll. Sarah Chun handled the dormitories, a graduate student working nights to pay for her education. Both were good people who did their jobs competently and went home to lives that made sense. Both assumed Victoria was just another lifer in the security game, someone who'd never done anything more dangerous than ask teenagers to keep the noise down. They had no idea that the woman sitting quietly in the security office had once fast-roped from helicopters into places that didn't appear on any map. They couldn't know that her hands, now busy filling out incident reports about burned-out light bulbs and suspicious sounds that turned out to be raccoons, had once assembled explosive devices in complete darkness while enemy fighters searched for her team just meters away. The contrast wasn't lost on Victoria. 3 years ago, she'd been responsible for operations that could shift the balance of power in entire regions. Now her biggest concern was making sure the library doors were properly locked. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the vote that ended her military career, Victoria had spent 6 months trying to figure out how to exist in a world where her 20-year career meant less than a high school diploma. The Army had given her an honorable discharge, glowing recommendations, and a pension that would keep her fed and housed for the rest of her life. What they couldn't give her was a sense of purpose that filled the hole left by losing the only family she'd ever known. She'd tried contractor work first, the natural progression for most special operations veterans. The money was better, the mission parameters were clearer, and nobody asked uncomfortable questions about why someone with her qualifications was suddenly available for hire. But every briefing, every mission, every debriefing reminded her of what she'd lost. The contractor teams were full of professionals, but they lacked the deeper connection that came from years of trust in your life to the same group of people. They were colleagues, not family. After 8 months of flying to places she couldn't name to do things she couldn't discuss for people who paid well but didn't care about anything beyond results, Victoria had walked away from that world too. She'd taken the security job in Riverside, not because it paid well or offered advancement opportunities, but because it was the opposite of everything she'd lost. Quiet instead of chaotic, predictable instead of dangerous, solitary instead of requiring the kind of trust She wasn't sure she could give anyone ever again. The college community had embraced her, with the kind of low-key acceptance that small towns were famous for. To them, she was just Vic, the night security guard who showed up on time, did her job without complaint, and minded her own business. Students occasionally chatted with her during late-night study sessions. Faculty members nodded politely when they worked late, and the maintenance staff appreciated that she actually read the reports they filed about building issues. She'd become part of the background fabric of the place, essential but unremarkable. Victoria had perfected the art of being underestimated. Her uniform was deliberately loose-fitting, hiding the lean muscle that 2 decades of military conditioning had carved into her frame. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, kept her makeup minimal, and spoke in the soft tones of someone who preferred listening to talking. When she walked her rounds, her movement was purposeful but unhurried, efficient but not threatening. She'd learned to project competence without authority, capability without menace. But sometimes, late at night when the campus was truly empty and the weight of solitude pressed down like a physical force, Victoria would allow herself to remember who she used to be. Master Sergeant Victoria Castellanos, Team Leader, Alpha Squad, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. The woman who'd led operations in Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and half a dozen other places where American interests required the kind of surgical precision that regular military units couldn't provide. The soldier who'd earned 3 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and the kind of reputation that opened doors throughout the special operations community. The woman who'd been voted out by her own team because she'd made a decision that saved lives, but violated orders. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same qualities that had made her exceptional in special operations, independent thinking, moral courage, willingness to take calculated risks, had ultimately led to her downfall. In the military, there was a fine line between leadership and insubordination, between tactical innovation and failure to follow orders. Victoria had crossed that line to save civilian lives during a hostage rescue operation in Syria. And while her actions had been tactically successful and morally justified, they'd also been technically unauthorized. The after-action review had been a masterpiece of political theater. Officially, the mission was classified as a success. 12 hostages rescued, minimal collateral damage, all team members returned safely. Unofficially, Victoria's decision to deviate from the operational plan had created concerns about command structure and unit cohesion. The review board had recommended additional training and closer supervision for future operations. Her teammates had voted differently. In a closed-door session that would never appear in any official record, the 7 other members of Alpha Squad had been asked a simple question. Did they still trust Master Sergeant Castellanos to lead them in combat? 5 had voted no. 2 had abstained. 0 had voted yes. Victoria had been given the option of requesting transfer to another unit, accepting a demotion, or taking an honorable discharge with full benefits. She'd chosen to leave rather than spend the remainder of her career trying to rebuild trust with people who decided she was more liability than asset. Some betrayals were too fundamental to overcome, and being rejected by the people you'd been willing to die for was one of them. Now, she sat in the security office in Oregon, monitoring cameras that showed empty hallways and writing reports about maintenance issues, while somewhere in the world, other teams were conducting the kind of operations she'd once led. The transition from sergeant to security guard might have looked like failure to outside observers, but Victoria had made peace with her choices. She'd saved those hostages, even if it had cost her everything she'd worked 20 years to build. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her thoughts with its harsh electronic tone. Victoria glanced at the caller ID and saw a number she didn't recognize, though something about the area code seemed familiar. After 3 rings, she picked up. Riverside Community College Security, this is Vic. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in 3 years, but would recognize anywhere. Colonel Marcus Webb, former commanding officer of 1st SFODD, the man who'd signed her discharge papers and wished her well in civilian life. "Sergeant Castellanos," he said, using her former rank. "We need to talk." Victoria's hand tightened on the phone receiver as Colonel Webb's voice transported her instantly back to a world she'd tried to leave behind. 3 years of careful emotional distance collapsed in the space of a heartbeat, and she found herself sitting straighter in her chair, unconsciously adopting the posture of a soldier receiving orders from a superior officer. "Colonel," she replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the storm of questions and emotions his call had triggered. "It's been a while." "Too long," Webb said, and there was something in his tone that Victoria recognized from their operational days. The careful control of a man delivering bad news to someone he respected. "Vic, I'm calling because we have a situation, and you're the only person who can help us." Victoria glanced around the quiet security office, noting the surreal disconnect between her current surroundings and the conversation she was having. The monitors still showed empty hallways and vacant parking lots, the coffee was still terrible, and the fluorescent lights still hummed with their persistent buzz. But suddenly, the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her former life were beginning to crack. "Sir, with respect, I'm not in the military anymore, haven't been for 3 years. I'm sure whatever situation you're dealing with, you have plenty of qualified personnel who can handle it." Webb was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could hear something in the background that sounded like radio chatter and the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of desperation, carefully masked by professional calm. "Alpha Squad is missing, Vic. All 7 of them." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the vote that had ended her career, those 7 soldiers had been her team for 8 years. She'd trained with them, fought beside them, bled with them in places where bleeding meant dying if your teammates didn't have your back. The personal betrayal still stung, but the thought of them in danger triggered every protective instinct she'd developed over 2 decades of military service. "Where?" she asked, the single word carrying more emotional weight than she'd intended. "Northern Afghanistan, Wakhan Corridor." They were conducting a reconnaissance mission in the Pamir Mountains when their last communication came in 6 hours ago. Single word transmission, compromised, nothing since then. Victoria's mind automatically began processing tactical information, falling back into patterns of analysis that 3 years of civilian life hadn't been able to erase. The Wakhan Corridor was some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. A narrow strip of Afghan territory that bordered Pakistan, China, and Tajikistan. The mountains there rose to over 20,000 feet. The weather was unpredictable and deadly, and the local population included tribes that had been fighting outsiders since before Alexander the Great. "Extraction attempts?" she asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. 2 helicopter missions turned back due to weather. The storm system that moved through the region has grounded all aircraft for at least 48 hours, maybe longer. Ground insertion through Pakistan is politically impossible right now. The Chinese and Tajik borders are sealed tighter than a drum. There's literally no way to get a rescue team in there through conventional means. Victoria stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Oregon drizzle, while her mind worked through the tactical puzzle Webb was presenting. She'd studied the Wakhan Corridor during her special operations training, had even conducted simulated exercises based on operations in similar terrain. But studying something in a classroom and actually operating in an environment where the mountains themselves were trying to kill you were very different things. "Colonel, even if I wanted to help, I'm not exactly equipped for high-altitude mountain rescue operations. I'm a security guard at a community college. I don't have clearance, I don't have gear, and I sure as hell don't have a way to get to Afghanistan." That's where you're wrong, Webb said, and Victoria could hear the careful calculation in his voice. Do you remember Operation Glacier Walker? The question hit Victoria like a thunderbolt. Operation Glacier Walker had been a theoretical mission. Profile she'd developed during her final year with Delta Force. A contingency plan for inserting small teams into high-altitude, extreme weather environments where conventional insertion methods were impossible. She'd spent months researching high-altitude physiology, cold weather survival techniques, and unconventional infiltration methods. The operation had never been implemented, but the research and planning had been exhaustive. That was just theoretical work, sir. Wargaming scenarios that would probably never happen. Except now they are happening. Vic, the terrain where Alpha Squad is missing matches your Glacier Walker parameters almost exactly. High altitude, extreme weather, politically sensitive borders, conventional rescue impossible. You didn't just study that environment, you developed the only tactical framework we have for operating in it. Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Oregon weather. Operation Glacier Walker had been her attempt to solve an unsolvable problem, the kind of intellectual challenge that had always driven her to push beyond conventional thinking. She'd approached it like a puzzle, developing innovative solutions for equipment, logistics, insertion methods, and survival techniques. But it had always been theoretical, a mental exercise rather than a real-world application. Sir, even if the theoretical framework applies, implementing it would require specialized equipment, extensive planning, and a team with specific training. You can't just improvise something like that. We're not asking you to improvise anything, Webb said. Quietly, we're asking you to do what you've always done. Lead a mission that nobody else can lead, in a place where nobody else can operate. To bring home soldiers who need someone willing to take calculated risks to save their lives. The parallel to Syria wasn't lost on Victoria. Once again, conventional approaches had failed. Once again, soldiers were in danger with no official way to reach them. Once again, she was being asked to make decisions that would probably violate standing orders and operating procedures. The only difference was that this time, the soldiers she'd be risking everything to save were the same ones who'd voted her out of their lives 3 years ago. Colonel, there's something we need to address before this conversation goes any further. Those 7 soldiers made it very clear that they didn't trust my judgment or my leadership. They voted me out of Delta Force because they believed I was a liability. Why would you think they'd want my help now? Webb's sigh was audible through the phone connection. Because right now, Vic, you're not their former team leader. You're the only person who knows how to reach them. Personal feelings don't matter when lives are hanging in the balance. Victoria walked back to her desk and sat down, staring at the monitors that showed a world so far removed from high-altitude rescue operations that it might as well have been another planet. The irony was overwhelming. For 3 years she'd convinced herself that her military career was over, that her skills and knowledge belonged to a past she couldn't return to. Now she was being told that everything she'd learned, everything she'd developed, might be the key to saving the very people who'd rejected her. What's the timeline? She asked, hating herself for asking, but unable to ignore the possibility that American soldiers were dying while she wrestled with personal grievances. 48 hours, Webb said. After that, if they're injured or trapped, the cold will kill them regardless of any other factors. The temperature in that region drops to 30 below zero at night, and it's only getting colder as the storm system intensifies. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to imagine Alpha Squad somewhere in the Pamir Mountains, possibly injured, definitely cold, and running out of time while she sat in a warm office 3,000 miles away. The personal betrayal still burned. But the oath she'd taken 20 years ago didn't have exceptions for hurt feelings or wounded pride. I need details, she said finally. Everything you have. Mission parameters, last known position, equipment manifest, weather reports, terrain analysis. All of it. Webb's relief was audible. There's a secure terminal at the Portland Air National Guard Base. Can you be there in 2 hours? Victoria looked around the security office one more time, knowing that walking out that door would mean stepping back into a world she'd tried to leave behind. But somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, 7 soldiers were running out of time, and she was the only person who might be able to reach them. "I'll be there," she said. The Portland Air National Guard Base looked exactly like every other military installation Victoria had visited over the past 20 years. All angular buildings and purposeful efficiency, wrapped in chain-link fence and guarded by soldiers young enough to be her children. She parked her 15-year-old Honda Civic between a row of government vehicles and walked toward the main gate, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her civilian clothes and worn sneakers. The MP at the security checkpoint was maybe 22 years old, with the kind of crisp uniform and earnest attention to procedure that marked him as someone still trying to prove he belonged. His name tag read Harrison, and when Victoria approached with her driver's license and the temporary access code Colonel Webb had provided, Harrison's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed skepticism. "Ma'am, this code shows you're cleared for the intelligence center," Harrison said, studying his computer screen with the concentration of someone who'd never seen anything like it before. "But I don't show any identification or current security clearance on file." Victoria had expected this. To anyone checking official databases, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a civilian security guard with no current military affiliation. Her clearances had been revoked when she'd left the service. Her personnel file had been archived, and her access to classified facilities had been terminated. On paper, she had no more business being on a military base than any other random citizen. "The access was arranged by Colonel Webb," she said patiently. "There should be a note in the system about special circumstances." Harrison scrolled through several screens, his frown deepening with each passing second. "Ma'am, I see the temporary access code, but it doesn't specify what kind of consultation you're providing. For security purposes, I need to understand why a civilian is being granted access to classified facilities." Before Victoria could respond, a voice cut through the conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed from his path. "Is there a problem here, specialist?" Victoria turned to see a man in his mid-30s approaching the checkpoint, wearing the digital camouflage uniform of an active-duty officer and the kind of confident stride that marked him as someone who'd never had his orders questioned. His name tag read Carter, and his rank insignia showed him to be a major, probably the base operations officer or intelligence chief. "Sir, I have a civilian here with temporary access codes, but no clearance verification or stated purpose for the visit," Harrison explained, clearly relieved to pass the problem up the chain of command. "Major." Carter studied Victoria with the calculating look of someone trying to categorize what he was seeing. Middle-aged woman in civilian clothes, no obvious credentials, requesting access to secure facilities in the middle of the night. To him, she probably looked like exactly what she was supposed to look like, a consultant or contractor who'd been called in for some routine support function. "Miss Castellanos?" Carter asked, consulting the tablet he'd been carrying. "That's correct," Victoria replied, noting that he'd used her civilian title rather than her former military rank. "I'm Major Carter, Base Intelligence Officer." "I understand. You're here to provide some kind of consultation regarding a situation in Afghanistan. Can you tell me what specific expertise you're bringing to this operation?" Victoria recognized the challenge in Carter's tone. He was politely asking her to justify her presence, to explain why a civilian had been called in when the military had plenty of its own experts. It was a reasonable question from his perspective, but one that she couldn't answer without revealing information that was likely above his security clearance level. I developed some theoretical frameworks that may be applicable to the current situation, she said carefully. Colonel Webb felt my input could be valuable. Carter's expression suggested he found this explanation about as convincing as she'd expected. In his experience, theoretical frameworks developed by civilian consultants were usually academic exercises with limited real-world application. The kind of thing that looked good in PowerPoint presentations, but fell apart when confronted with actual operational realities. I see. And this theoretical work involved high-altitude rescue operations? Among other things, Victoria replied, maintaining the careful neutrality of someone who couldn't say more without compromising operational security. Carter glanced at his watch, clearly weighing his options. He could delay Victoria's access, while he made phone calls to verify her credentials and purpose. But that would take time and might interfere with whatever urgent situation had prompted her presence. Alternatively, he could trust that someone at Colonel Webb's level wouldn't waste resources on useless consultation and allow her to proceed. Specialist Harrison, process her access and escort her to the SCIF, Carter decided. Miss Castellanos, someone will meet you there to brief you on the situation. The sensitive compartmented information facility was located in the basement of the base's intelligence building, behind multiple layers of security that included badge scanners, biometric readers, and a final checkpoint staffed by 2 guards who looked like they could bench press small cars. Victoria submitted to each security measure with the patience of someone who'd been through similar procedures countless times, though she noted that every step reinforced her current status as an outsider requiring special handling. The SCIF itself was a windowless room dominated by multiple large-screen displays and workstations equipped with secure communication systems. The walls were lined with maps showing various global hotspots, and the air carried the faint electronic hum of sophisticated monitoring equipment. 3 people were already present when Victoria arrived, a young intelligence analyst whose name tag read Chun, a communications specialist identified as Rodriguez, and a mountain warfare expert wearing the distinctive beret and patch of the 10th Mountain Division, the mountain warfare expert. A weathered-looking sergeant first class named Thompson looked up when Victoria entered and made no effort to hide his skepticism. "You're the civilian consultant?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd been hoping for someone who looked more like what he'd expected. "I am," Victoria replied simply. Thompson gestured toward one of the large displays, which showed a topographical map of the Wakhan Corridor, marked with weather overlays and threat assessments. "Ma'am, I've been doing mountain operations for 12 years, including 3 deployments to Afghanistan. I've studied this region extensively, and I can tell you that what we're dealing with here is beyond the capabilities of any conventional rescue operation. The terrain is hostile, the weather is life-threatening, and the political situation makes support operations nearly impossible." Victoria studied the map display, noting details that confirmed her earlier assessment of the tactical situation. The last position of Alpha Squad was marked with a red icon in a region where the mountains rose to over 18,000 feet, where the nearest potential landing zone was more than 20 kilometers away, and where the current weather conditions included winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and temperatures that would kill an unprotected human being in less than an hour. "Sergeant Thompson is correct about the conventional approaches," Victoria said, moving closer to the display. "Which is why conventional approaches won't work." Chun, the intelligence analyst, looked up from her workstation. "Ma'am, the theoretical framework you developed, Operation Glacier Walker, it involves some pretty unconventional insertion methods. Are you suggesting those techniques could actually be implemented in real-world conditions?" Victoria was surprised that Chun knew the operation's code name, but realized that Colonel Webb must have briefed the team on at least the basic parameters of what they were dealing with. "The techniques were designed specifically for conditions where conventional methods are impossible," she said. The question isn't whether they could work, but whether anyone is prepared to accept the risks involved in implementing them. Thompson's expression shifted from skepticism to interest. What kind of risks are we talking about? Victoria turned back to the map display and began pointing to specific locations and terrain features. High altitude, low opening parachute. Insertion at altitudes that would normally be considered unsurvivable. Extended operations in conditions where equipment failure means certain death. Navigation through terrain that has no margin for error. And all of it conducted by personnel who would be operating at the absolute limits of human endurance. The room was quiet for a moment as the implications of what she was describing sank in. Rodriguez, the communications specialist, was the first to speak. "Ma'am, what you're describing sounds like a suicide mission." Victoria met his gaze directly. "Sergeant, 7 American soldiers are somewhere in those mountains with no way out. Doing nothing is also a suicide mission. The only difference is that it's their suicide, not ours." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence. These were all military professionals who understood that sometimes impossible choices had to be made. That sometimes the only difference between a rescue mission and a suicide mission was the skill and determination of the people willing to take the risk. Thompson studied the map for another long moment, then looked back at Victoria with something approaching respect. "Ma'am, I'm starting to think there's more to your theoretical framework than I initially assumed. But implementing something like this would require personnel with very specific training and experience. Where exactly are we going to find people qualified for this kind of operation?" Victoria looked around the room at the faces of the military professionals who were beginning to understand that she wasn't just another civilian consultant brought in to provide academic perspective. "Sergeant, that's where the theory stops. And the real work begins." Colonel Webb's voice crackled through the secure video connection from Bagram Airfield, his image pixelated by the encrypted transmission, but his urgency unmistakable. Behind him, Victoria could see the controlled chaos of a command center in crisis mode, with staff officers moving between workstations and multiple conversations happening simultaneously. The clock on the wall showed they were now 36 hours into the emergency, with time running out faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. "The weather window is narrowing," Webb said without preamble. "Satellite imagery shows another storm system moving in from the north. If we don't get someone on the ground within the next 18 hours, we'll be looking at a week-long delay minimum." Victoria leaned forward in her chair, studying the tactical displays that showed real-time weather data overlaid on the topographical map of the search area. The new storm front was massive, stretching across hundreds of miles and carrying the kind of extreme conditions that made the current situation look manageable by comparison. Wind speeds approaching hurricane force, temperatures that would drop another 20 degrees, and snow accumulation that would make movement across the terrain virtually impossible. "Sir, based on the Glacier Walker protocols, there's still a viable insertion window," Victoria said, pointing to a narrow corridor on the map display. "The approach would have to be from the southeast, using the thermal updrafts along this ridgeline to offset the wind patterns. High-altitude insertion here, then traverse across this glacier system to reach the last known position." "Sergeant." Thompson, who had been studying the same data, shook his head immediately. "Ma'am, with respect, what you're describing is a textbook suicide mission. That insertion point is at 19,000 feet in conditions that would challenge the most EXPERIENCED high-altitude teams. The traverse you're talking about crosses terrain that mountaineering experts wouldn't attempt in perfect weather, let alone in a blizzard." Major Carter, who had joined the briefing via secure link from his office, leaned forward on the video. "Connection, I have to agree with Sergeant Thompson. The risk assessment on this operation is off the charts. We'd be asking personnel to attempt something that has never been successfully executed under these conditions." Victoria felt the familiar frustration of watching military professionals retreat into the safety of conventional thinking when faced with unconventional challenges. She'd seen it countless times during her Delta Force career, the tendency to default to standard operating procedures even when the situation demanded innovative solutions. But she also understood their hesitation. What she was proposing would push human endurance and equipment capability to their absolute limits. "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns about the risk profile," she said carefully. "But we need to consider the risk of inaction as well. If Alpha Squad is injured and exposed to these conditions for another week, we won't be conducting a rescue operation. We'll be conducting a body recovery." Chun, the intelligence analyst, looked up from her workstation where she'd been monitoring. "Communications intercepts. Ma'am, there's another factor we need to consider. Signal intelligence suggests there may be hostile forces in the area. We're picking up radio traffic that indicates local Taliban commanders are aware of foreign military presence in the region. If Alpha Squad is being actively hunted, time becomes even more critical. The revelation that enemy forces might be involved added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Victoria's mind automatically began factoring in the additional variables: the need for stealth during insertion, the possibility that Alpha Squad might be evading capture, rather than simply waiting for rescue, the potential for armed contact during the operation. All of it pointed toward the need for personnel with combat experience rather than traditional search and rescue specialists. Colonel Webb's voice cut through the tactical discussion with the authority of someone who'd made similar decisions under pressure countless times before. "We need to identify qualified personnel for this operation. Sergeant Thompson, what's the availability of high-altitude specialists from 10th Mountain?" Thompson consulted his tablet before responding. "Sir, we have qualified personnel, but deployment timeline would be at least 24 hours. Getting them briefed, equipped, and inserted would push us past the weather window. And frankly, sir, even our most experienced mountain warfare specialists would be operating beyond their normal parameters on this one." Rodriguez, the communications specialist, added his own perspective to the growing list of challenges. "Sir, there's also the question of command and control once the team is on the ground. Radio communications are going to be severely limited by the terrain and weather conditions. Whoever goes in there is going to be operating essentially blind, with no real-time support or guidance." Victoria listened to the conversation with increasing frustration, watching as each military professional added another reason why the operation couldn't be conducted. She understood their concerns, appreciated their professional caution, but she also knew that while they were discussing the theoretical impossibility of the mission, 7 soldiers were running out of time and conditions that were killing them by degrees. "There is another option," she said quietly, her words cutting through the technical discussion. Major Carter looked at her with the patient expression of someone humoring a civilian consultant who didn't fully understand military realities. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input on the theoretical aspects of this operation, but what we're dealing with now is practical implementation. We need qualified military personnel with specific training and current certifications. I have those qualifications," Victoria said simply. The silence that followed her statement was profound. Thompson was the first to respond, his tone carrying the diplomatic courtesy of someone trying not to offend a civilian while making obvious practical points. "Ma'am, I'm sure you have relevant educational background and theoretical knowledge. But this operation would require someone with actual combat experience, high-altitude training, and current physical qualifications. We're talking about inserting into a combat zone under extreme conditions." Victoria felt the familiar sting of being dismissed based on assumptions about her capabilities and background. To these military professionals, she was a middle-aged civilian consultant who developed some interesting theoretical frameworks, but lacked the real-world experience to implement them. They couldn't see past her current status as a community college security guard to recognize what she'd been, what she was still capable of being. "I understand your concerns," she said, maintaining professional composure despite her growing frustration. "But I think there may be some gaps in your understanding of my background and qualifications." Colonel Webb's voice from the video connection carried a note of warning that the others missed, but Victoria recognized immediately. "Ms. Castellanos, perhaps we should focus on identifying the best available military assets for this operation." The message was clear. Webb was telling her to back down, to accept her role as a consultant rather than pushing to become an active participant. But Victoria had spent too many years watching soldiers die while bureaucrats debated the finer points of proper procedure to accept that kind of institutional cowardice. Now Chun looked up from her intelligence workstation with information that drove home the urgency of their situation. "Sirs, I'm seeing increased radio chatter from Taliban units in the region. It sounds like they're organizing search parties. If Alpha Squad is trying to evade capture, they may not have the luxury of staying in one location and waiting for rescue." The implications were clear. If enemy forces were actively hunting Alpha Squad, the team would be forced to keep moving in conditions that were already testing their survival capabilities. Every hour of delay increased the chances that when a rescue team finally reached the area, they would find nothing but empty mountains and scattered equipment. Major Carter leaned back in his chair, the weight of command decision visible in his expression. "Colonel Webb, I need to be honest about our capabilities here. The personnel and resources required for this operation are beyond what we can reasonably deploy within the time constraints. We may need to consider that this rescue attempt is not feasible under current conditions." Victoria felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest as she listened to a room full of military professionals essentially writing off 7 American soldiers because the mission parameters fell outside their comfort zone. These were good people, competent professionals who genuinely wanted to help, but they were trapped by the limitations of conventional thinking and institutional procedure. "With respect, Major," she said, her voice carrying more steel than she'd intended. "Those 7 soldiers didn't volunteer for a feasible mission when they joined Alpha Squad. They volunteered to go wherever their country needed them to go, regardless of the risk. The least we can do is show them the same courage they've shown us." Thompson looked at her with something approaching sympathy. "Ma'am, courage isn't the issue here, it's capability. This operation requires skills and experience that take years to develop, and frankly, it requires someone young enough and fit enough to survive conditions that would kill most people." The dismissal was polite, but absolute. In their minds, Victoria was a well-meaning civilian whose heart was in the right place but whose capabilities were limited to theoretical analysis and academic consultation. They couldn't imagine that the middle-aged woman sitting across from them might be exactly the person they needed. If only they were willing to look past their assumptions and see what was actually there. Victoria looked around the room at the faces of military professionals who were about to abandon 7 American soldiers because they couldn't conceive of a solution that fell outside their standard operating procedures. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, Alpha Squad was running out of time while the very people responsible for rescuing them debated the theoretical impossibility of doing so. It was time to stop being polite about her qualifications. Victoria stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled in a way that caused everyone in the room to unconsciously focus their attention on her. The casual, almost deferential posture she'd maintained throughout the briefing was gone, replaced by something that radiated quiet authority and barely contained frustration. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of steel that comes from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your professional concern about qualifications and capability," she said, reaching into her jacket pocket. "But I think it's time we had an honest conversation about exactly who you're talking to." She pulled out a small leather wallet and placed it on the conference table. When she opened it, the room's fluorescent lights caught the gleam of metal. That made Thompson's breath catch audibly. Inside the wallet was a collection of military decorations, each one mounted on a small pin backing, 3 bronze stars, a silver star, the combat medical badge, master parachutist wings with combat star, and a collection of unit citations that represented deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 2 decades. Master Sergeant Victoria Castellanos, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Retired, she said, her voice carrying the quiet pride of someone who'd earned every piece of metal in that wallet. 8 years team leader, Alpha Squad. 47 combat operations across 6 countries. Current qualifications include Halo Jumpmaster, Advanced Mountaineering Instructor, Combat Medic Specialist, and Survival Instructor. The silence that followed was deafening. Thompson stared at the decorations with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been fundamentally altered. Rodriguez's mouth was actually hanging open. Chun had stopped typing entirely, her hands frozen over her keyboard as she processed what she was seeing. Major Carter's voice came through the video connection as barely more than a whisper. "Jesus Christ, you're Alpha Squad's former team leader." "That's correct," Victoria said, closing the wallet but leaving it on the table where everyone could see it. "The same Alpha Squad that's currently missing in the Wakhan Corridor. The same Alpha Squad that voted me out of Delta Force 3 years ago because they disagreed with my tactical decisions during a hostage rescue operation in Syria." Colonel. Webb's expression on the video screen had shifted from professional concern to something approaching relief, mixed with apprehension. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but Victoria could see that he hadn't expected her to reveal her background quite so dramatically or so completely. "Sergeant Castellanos," Webb said carefully, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room here. Your former teammates specifically voted no confidence in your leadership. How does that factor into the current situation?" Victoria had been expecting this question since the moment Webb had called her. The vote of no confidence was part of her permanent record, a black mark that had effectively ended her military career and would follow her forever. But it was also the reason she was uniquely qualified for this particular mission. "Sir, my former teammates voted me out because I made a tactical decision that saved 12 hostages, but violated direct orders," she said, meeting Webb's gaze through the video connection. "I chose to prioritize civilian lives over mission parameters. That decision cost me my career, but it saved 12 innocent people from execution." Thompson leaned forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by intense professional interest. "Ma'am, what specific tactical decision did you make?" Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the weight of that choice and everything it had cost her. The operational plan called for a precision strike that would have eliminated the terrorists, but also killed the hostages. Intel assessment was that acceptable losses were justified by the strategic value of the target. I disagreed. "So what did you do?" Chun asked, her analyst's mind clearly fascinated by the tactical puzzle. "I improvised a different approach. Instead of the authorized strike, I led Alpha Squad in a direct assault that required us to breach the building through 3 separate entry points simultaneously. Higher risk to my team, lower probability of mission success, according to the computers, but 0 risk to civilian casualties." Rodriguez whistled softly. "That's the kind of decision that either makes you a hero or gets you court-martialed." "In my case, it got me voted out by my own team," Victoria said with a bitter smile. "They felt that my willingness to deviate from orders made me unpredictable and dangerous. They voted that they could no longer trust me to follow operational parameters when the stakes were high." Major Carter's voice carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "Ma'am, do you regret that decision?" Victoria looked around the room at the faces of military professionals who were beginning to understand that the woman they'd dismissed as a civilian consultant was actually more qualified for this operation than anyone they could deploy. Major, I've never regretted saving innocent lives. I've regretted the personal cost of that decision, but not the decision itself. Thompson stood up and walked over to the tactical display, studying the terrain with the focused intensity of someone whose perspective had just been fundamentally altered. Ma'am, if you were going to implement Operation Glacier Walker, how would you actually do it? Not the theoretical framework, but the practical execution. Victoria joined him at the display, and for the first time since entering the room, she felt like she was being asked the right questions by people who might actually understand the answers. The insertion would have to be a halo jump from 30,000 feet, using the jet stream to cover the horizontal distance and oxygen rebreathers to survive the altitude. Single operator, minimal equipment load, relying on speed and stealth. Rather than firepower. Single operator? Chun asked. Ma'am, you're talking about a solo mission into some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. That's correct, Victoria said simply. Larger teams create larger signatures, require more resources, and move slower across difficult terrain. For this mission, one person with the right skills has a better chance of success than a full squad with conventional training. Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. Ma'am, what you're describing is essentially a suicide mission. Even if you successfully locate Alpha Squad, how would you extract 7 wounded soldiers across 20 kilometers of mountain terrain in blizzard conditions? Victoria had been working through this problem since Webb's initial phone call, gaming out scenarios and contingencies with the methodical precision that had made her successful in special operations. The extraction wouldn't be through conventional evacuation. Alpha Squad knows this terrain, they know survival protocols, and they know how to work as a team under extreme conditions. My job wouldn't be to carry them out. My job would be to reach them, assess their condition, and guide them to a location where conventional rescue becomes possible. Major Carter leaned forward, his expression showing the kind of focused attention that meant he was seriously considering what Victoria was proposing. And you believe you could successfully execute this mission alone? Victoria looked around the room one more time, seeing military professionals who were finally beginning to understand that the solution to their impossible problem might be standing right in front of them. Major, 3 years ago, Alpha Squad voted that they couldn't trust me to make the right decisions under pressure. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now. But right now, the only thing that matters is that 7 American soldiers are running out of time, and I'm the only person in this room who's actually qualified to reach them. The weight of her statement settled over the room like a physical presence. These were all competent military professionals, but none of them had the combination of skills, experience, and detailed knowledge of both the terrain and the missing soldiers that this mission required. Victoria wasn't just uniquely qualified for this operation. She was the only person who could execute it successfully. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Colonel Webb's voice cut through the tactical discussion with the authority of command decision. Sergeant Castellanos, are you volunteering for this mission? Victoria met his gaze through the video connection, knowing that her answer would determine whether 7 soldiers lived or died, and whether she would finally have the chance to prove that the decision that had cost her everything had been the right one after all. Sir, I'm not volunteering, she said quietly. I'm stating that I'm the only person who can do this job, and those soldiers don't have time for anyone else to figure out how. The equipment testing facility at Portland Air National Guard Base looked like a cross between a laboratory and a torture chamber, filled with altitude chambers, environmental simulators, and monitoring equipment designed to push human physiology to its absolute limits. Victoria stood in the center of the room wearing a flight suit that had been hastily requisitioned in her size, surrounded by technicians who were clearly skeptical about subjecting a middle-aged civilian to testing protocols. Designed for elite military personnel. Ma'am, these evaluations are typically conducted over a period of weeks, said Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the senior technician responsible for the facility. We're going to be compressing months of qualification testing into the next 6 hours. Some of these protocols haven't been attempted by personnel over the age of 35. Victoria adjusted the harness system that would monitor her vital signs throughout the testing sequence, noting the concerned expressions of the medical personnel who'd been called in to supervise what everyone assumed would be a demonstration of why civilian consultants shouldn't attempt military qualification standards. She'd requested the testing herself, knowing that no amount of discussion about her background would convince these professionals as effectively as demonstrating her current capabilities. Chief, I understand the risks, Victoria said calmly. But 7 soldiers don't have weeks for me to complete standard qualification protocols. They have hours. Major Carter stood behind a wall of safety glass in the observation area, flanked by Thompson, Rodriguez, and Chun, all of whom had volunteered to witness what they expected to be either an impressive demonstration or a dramatic failure. The video connection to Colonel Webb remained active, allowing him to monitor the proceedings from Bagram Airfield, where he was coordinating the broader rescue operation. The first test was hypoxic tolerance, designed to simulate the effects of extreme altitude on cognitive function and physical performance. Victoria entered the altitude chamber that would gradually reduce oxygen levels to simulate conditions at 30,000 feet, the altitude required for her proposed halo insertion. Most people lost consciousness within minutes at that simulated altitude without supplemental oxygen. Beginning altitude simulation, announced the technician monitoring the chamber controls. Ascending to flight level 300. Oxygen saturation will drop to approximately 40% of sea level normal. Through the chamber's viewing window, the observers watched Victoria's vital signs display on multiple monitors. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and brain activity were all being tracked in real time as the simulated altitude increased. At 20,000 feet equivalent, most people began showing signs of cognitive impairment. At 25,000 feet, coordination and decision-making capabilities were severely compromised. Victoria continued working through a series of complex, problem-solving exercises and fine motor skill tests as the altitude climbed past 30,000 feet. Her oxygen saturation had dropped to levels that should have rendered her unconscious, but her performance remained steady and focused. She completed navigation calculations, assembled complex mechanical devices, and responded to tactical scenarios with the calm precision of someone operating at sea level. "This is impossible," muttered one of the medical technicians. "Her oxygen saturation is at 62%. She should be comatose." Thompson leaned forward, studying the displays with the fascination of someone witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about human physiology. How is she still functioning at that level? Chief Williams checked his equipment readings twice before responding. High-altitude acclimatization can be trained, but this level of tolerance usually requires years of conditioning. And even then, most people don't maintain this kind of cognitive performance at extreme altitude. "She's not most people," Colonel Webb's voice came through the communication system from Afghanistan. Sergeant Castellanos spent 2 years training with Tibetan mountain guides during a classified operation. She's probably one of fewer than 50 people in the world with this level of natural high-altitude adaptation. After 40 minutes at simulated extreme altitude, Victoria was returned to normal atmospheric pressure and moved to the next phase of testing, cold weather survival protocols. The environmental chamber was capable of reproducing Arctic conditions, including temperatures down to -60 degrees Fahrenheit and wind speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour. Victoria entered the cold chamber wearing only the base layer clothing that would be available to her during the mission. The observers watched as she was subjected to conditions that replicated the worst-case weather scenarios she might encounter in the Wakhan Corridor. Most people would be showing signs of hypothermia within minutes in such conditions, but Victoria moved through a series of survival tasks with methodical efficiency. She built emergency shelters using improvised materials, started fires in impossible conditions, and demonstrated field medical techniques while her hands were nearly frozen. Throughout the entire simulation, she maintained core body temperature through breathing techniques and movement patterns that most of the observers had never seen before. Where did she learn that? Chun asked, watching Victoria use what appeared to be advanced yoga breathing techniques to maintain internal heat generation. Wim Hof method combined with Tibetan Tummo meditation, Rodriguez said, with obvious admiration. That's not standard military training. That's specialized knowledge that takes years to master. After the cold weather simulation, Victoria was moved to the final and most dangerous test, equipment proficiency under stress. She was fitted with a full halo jumping rig, including oxygen systems, navigation equipment, and the specialized gear required for extreme altitude insertion. The test would simulate the decision-making and equipment management required during a night jump in severe weather conditions. The simulation placed Victoria in a virtual reality environment that replicated jumping from 30,000 feet into a mountain storm system. She had to navigate using minimal visibility, manage oxygen systems while making rapid altitude changes, and solve equipment malfunctions while falling through simulated severe turbulence. The test was designed to overwhelm even experienced military parachutists with multiple simultaneous challenges. Victoria moved through the simulation with the fluid competence of someone who'd made similar jumps under actual combat conditions. When the simulation introduced a primary parachute malfunction, she executed emergency procedures without hesitation. When navigation systems failed, she switched to backup instruments and dead reckoning. When oxygen systems malfunctioned, she managed her breathing and descent rate to maintain consciousness until reaching survivable altitude. "Simulation complete," announced the technician. "All objectives achieved with zero safety violations and optimal performance scores across all categories." The observation room was silent for a long moment as the implications of what they'd witnessed sank in. Victoria had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded the qualification standards for the military's most elite units, while maintaining the calm composure of someone who considered such performance routine rather than exceptional. Major Carter was the first to speak. "Chief Williams, in your professional opinion, is Ms. Castellanos qualified to attempt the mission profile we've been discussing?" Chief Williams studied his test results for another moment before responding. "Sir, in 23 years of conducting these evaluations, I've never seen anyone demonstrate this level of capability across all testing categories. Most of our elite special operations personnel excel in one or two areas, but show limitations in others. What we just witnessed represents capabilities that are literally off the charts." Thompson walked over to the equipment area where Victoria was removing her test gear, his expression showing a mixture of respect and amazement. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your current civilian status. What you just demonstrated is beyond anything I've seen from active duty personnel." Victoria finished stowing her gear and turned to face the group of military professionals, who were now looking at her with the kind of respect usually reserved for legendary figures rather than community college security guards. "Gentlemen, the tests prove I can survive the insertion and operate in the target environment. But the real question isn't whether I can reach Alpha Squad. The question is whether you're willing to authorize a mission that violates every standard operating procedure in the book." Colonel Webb's voice carried through the communication system with the weight of command decision. "Sergeant Castellanos, based on what I've just witnessed, I'm prepared to authorize this operation." But I need you to understand that once you're on the ground, you'll be completely on your own. No backup. No support, no extraction if things go wrong. Victoria looked around the room at the faces of people who now understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A middle-aged woman who'd been written off by the system, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded those of personnel. Half her age and twice her apparent credentials. But she also knew that surviving qualification tests and surviving the mountains of Afghanistan were very different challenges. "Colonel, I've been on my own for 3 years," she said quietly. "The only difference is that now I have a chance to do something that matters again." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of what was being proposed. In the next few hours, Victoria would either vindicate every choice she'd made over the past 20 years of service, or she would disappear into the mountains of Afghanistan and never be seen again. The secure briefing room had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, leaving only Victoria, Colonel Webb via video link, Major Carter, and a man Victoria hadn't seen before. The newcomer wore civilian clothes but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to operating in the shadows. His identification read Special Activities Division, and when he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone whose job required him to deliver unpalatable truths. "Master Sergeant Castellanos, I'm Deputy Director Harrison from SAD," he said, settling into a chair across from Victoria. "What I'm about to tell you changes the parameters of this operation significantly, and I need you to understand the full scope of what you'd be walking into." Victoria felt a familiar chill settle in her stomach. In her experience, conversations that began with disclaimers about changing parameters usually ended with impossible choices and unacceptable risks. "I'm listening." Harrison activated a secure tablet and pulled up satellite imagery that showed the region where Alpha Squad had disappeared. But instead of the routine reconnaissance photos Victoria had been studying, these images showed clear evidence of organized activity, vehicle tracks, temporary structures, and movement patterns that indicated a significant hostile presence in the area. "Alpha Squad wasn't conducting a simple reconnaissance mission," Harrison said, his tone matter-of-fact despite the implications of what he was revealing. "They were tracking a high-value target, someone we've been hunting for 3 years. Intelligence indicated he was meeting with Taliban commanders to coordinate a major offensive against coalition forces." Victoria studied the satellite images, noting details that painted a picture far more complex and dangerous than she'd been led to believe. "And now Alpha Squad is missing in an area crawling with enemy forces who know they're there. It gets worse," Harrison continued. "The high-value target they were tracking is Halil Nazir, a former EC operative who's been coordinating attacks throughout the region. He's got significant resources, sophisticated communications equipment, and a personal hatred for American Special Operations personnel that borders on obsession." Major Carter leaned forward, his expression showing the kind of concern that comes from understanding tactical implications. "Sir, are you saying Alpha Squad walked into a trap?" "We don't know," Harrison admitted. Their last transmission was the single word "compromised," which could mean anything from blown operational security to active contact with enemy forces. But given Nazir's history and the intelligence assets he has available, there's a strong possibility that Alpha Squad's mission was leaked to hostile forces. The information hit Victoria like a physical blow. The mission she'd been planning was no longer a straightforward search and rescue operation in extreme weather conditions. It was a potential infiltration into hostile territory where enemy forces might be actively hunting American soldiers, where her insertion could be anticipated and prepared for, where every aspect of the operation would be exponentially more dangerous. "Colonel," Webb's voice came through the secure connection with the weight of someone delivering news he'd hoped never to share. "Victoria, there's something else you need to know. 3 hours ago, We intercepted radio communications, suggesting that Nazir's forces have captured at least some members of Alpha Squad alive. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest as the implications became clear. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a potential prisoner recovery operation in an area controlled by someone who had both the motivation and capability to extract intelligence from captured American soldiers through methods that didn't bear thinking about. How many? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Unknown, Harrison replied. The communications were fragmentary and in dialect. Our linguists believe they heard references to American prisoners and something about valuable information, but we can't confirm numbers or conditions. Victoria stood up and walked to the secure window that looked out over the base, watching aircraft taking off and landing in the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, members of Alpha Squad might be in the hands of someone who would torture them for information and then kill them regardless of what they revealed. The same soldiers who'd voted her out of Delta Force were now depending on her for their survival. There's more, Harrison said quietly. If Nazir has captured Alpha Squad numbers alive, he'll attempt to use them as leverage. These soldiers know operational details about ongoing missions throughout the region. Under interrogation, they could compromise operations that involve hundreds of other American personnel. The strategic implications were staggering. Alpha Squad wasn't just 7 soldiers in trouble. They were 7 soldiers whose capture could compromise ongoing operations and put hundreds of other American lives at risk. The mission Victoria was contemplating wasn't just about rescue anymore. It was about preventing an intelligence disaster that could affect the entire regional campaign. Major Carter turned to face Victoria with an expression that carried genuine sympathy. Ma'am, given these new parameters, I think we need to seriously reconsider whether this operation is feasible. What you'd be walking into is beyond the scope of what any single operator could handle, regardless of their qualifications. Victoria felt the weight of 20 years of military service pressing down on her as she considered what was being asked. The original mission had been dangerous enough: high-altitude insertion into extreme weather conditions, solo traverse across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, location and extraction of missing personnel. Now she was being asked to do all of that, while potentially operating in an area controlled by sophisticated enemy forces who might be expecting her arrival. What's the timeline for a conventional rescue operation? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Minimum 72 hours to deploy qualified personnel, Colonel Webb responded. More realistically, a week to properly plan and execute a mission of this complexity. And that assumes we can get authorization for a significant ground operation in politically sensitive territory. Victoria closed her eyes and did the mathematics of desperation. 72 hours for soldiers who might already be in enemy hands, being subjected to interrogation techniques designed to break them quickly and completely. A week for soldiers whose capture could compromise ongoing operations and endanger hundreds of other Americans. The timeline wasn't just about individual survival anymore. It was about strategic security for the entire region. There's one more thing you need to consider, Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering the final piece of an impossible puzzle. If you attempt this mission and fail, if you're captured or killed, the intelligence value of a former Delta Force team leader would be incalculable to someone like Nazir. You wouldn't just be risking your own life. You'd be risking the operational security of every special operations unit you've ever worked with. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Victoria understood what Harrison was really saying. Attempting this mission would mean gambling not just her own life, but potentially compromising years of classified operations and the lives of countless personnel who'd worked with her throughout her career. If she was captured, everything she knew could be extracted and used against American forces throughout the region. On the other hand, Colonel Webb added quietly, "You're also the only person who knows Alpha Squad well enough to predict their behavior under capture, who understands their training well enough to anticipate how they'll try to resist interrogation, and who has the tactical knowledge to locate them in an area where conventional forces can't operate." Victoria turned back to face the room full of people who were waiting for her decision. She could see in their faces the same conflict she was feeling, the recognition that what was being proposed was essentially a suicide mission, balanced against the certainty that doing nothing meant watching American soldiers die while their capture compromised ongoing operations. "If I do this," she said slowly, "there's no going back to my civilian life." Win or lose, Victoria Castellanos, the community college security guard, disappears forever. Harrison nodded grimly. "That's correct. Whether you succeed or fail, this operation will expose your background and current capabilities. Your cover as a retired veteran living quietly in Oregon will be permanently blown." Victoria looked around the room one more time, seeing the faces of military professionals who understood exactly what they were asking her to sacrifice. Not just her life, though that was certainly at risk, but her carefully constructed anonymity, her hard-won peace, her chance to live the rest of her life without the weight of impossible decisions and unacceptable choices. The woman who'd spent 3 years mopping floors and watching security monitors would disappear forever, replaced by someone who would either be remembered as a hero or become another name on a wall of fallen operators. There would be no middle ground, no quiet return to civilian life, no chance to fade back into the comfortable invisibility she'd worked so hard to achieve. But somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, 7 soldiers were running out of time, and she was the only person who could reach them. Victoria walked alone across the tarmac toward the C-130 transport aircraft that would carry her to the edge of the world. The pre-dawn air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of aviation fuel, and the distant ocean that reminded her of every deployment she'd ever made. Behind her, the lights of the base operations center continued their urgent work, coordinating the support elements that would get her as close as possible to the target area. Before she disappeared into the mountains alone, the aircraft's engines were already running, filling the air with the familiar vibration that spoke of controlled power and barely contained violence. She'd made this walk countless times over 20 years of military service, but never with the absolute certainty that she was walking away from everything she'd built in civilian life and toward something that would either vindicate every choice she'd made or end her story in the snow-covered peaks of Afghanistan. Her equipment load was minimal by special operations standards, but represented the absolute cutting edge of survival technology. The Halo rig included oxygen systems rated for extreme altitude, a GPS navigation suite hardened against electronic interference, and communications gear that would allow her to maintain contact until she reached the mountains where radio waves went to die. Her weapon was a custom-modified rifle that had been broken down into components, small enough to survive the insertion, but powerful enough to engage targets at extended range if the mission went kinetic. Most importantly, she carried medical supplies, specifically chosen for treating trauma in extreme conditions. If she found Alpha Squad alive, there was a high probability they would need immediate medical attention that couldn't wait for conventional evacuation. She'd packed medications that could keep someone alive long enough to reach help, surgical instruments that could function in sub-zero temperatures, and pain management drugs that could allow wounded soldiers to move across terrain that would challenge healthy personnel. The loadmaster, a grizzled technical sergeant who'd probably seen more strange cargo than most people could imagine, helped her aboard the aircraft with the professional courtesy of someone who didn't ask questions about passengers who jumped out of perfectly good airplanes in the middle of the night. The cargo bay was configured for high-altitude insertion, with oxygen systems and specialized equipment that would allow her to survive the ascent to 30,000 feet. "Ma'am, we'll reach the drop zone in approximately 4 hours," the loadmaster informed her as she conducted final equipment checks. "Weather reports show the storm system is intensifying, but the insertion window is still viable. After you exit the aircraft, you'll be completely on your own." Victoria nodded, understanding that the loadmaster was politely reminding her that once she left the aircraft, no one would be able to help her if things went wrong. There would be no radio contact. Once she reached the mountains, no extraction if she was injured, no backup if she encountered more than she could handle alone. She would succeed or disappear, with no middle ground between those outcomes. As the aircraft climbed toward operational altitude, Victoria found herself thinking about the 7 soldiers she was risking everything to reach. Marcus Webb, the squad's new team leader, barely 30 years old, but already carrying the weight of responsibility that came with leading elite soldiers into impossible situations. Sarah Martinez, the team medic whose quick thinking had saved lives in 3 different countries. James Patterson, the communications specialist who could make radios work in conditions that defeated conventional equipment. David Kim, the explosives expert whose precise work had opened doors that couldn't be opened any other way. Robert Jackson, the sniper whose ability to engage targets at impossible ranges had kept the team alive in situations where conventional tactics would have failed. Thomas Anderson, the engineer whose talent for improvising solutions had turned impossible missions into merely difficult ones. And Michael Foster, the youngest member of the team, whose combination of courage and intelligence had earned him acceptance into a unit where most operators had twice his experience. 3 years ago, these soldiers had voted that they couldn't trust her judgment under pressure. They decided that her willingness to prioritize saving lives over following orders made her too unpredictable to lead them in combat. The irony that she was now the only person willing to risk everything to save them wasn't lost on Victoria, but it didn't change her decision. Whatever personal conflicts existed between them, these were American soldiers in danger, and that was the only thing that mattered. The aircraft reached insertion altitude as they crossed into Afghan airspace, flying at the extreme edge of its operational envelope through air so thin that unprotected human beings would lose consciousness in seconds. Victoria moved to the jump door and began her final equipment checks, ensuring that every system was functioning properly and that she carried everything necessary to survive what came next. "Colonel," Webb's voice crackled through her communications. Headset one final time before she stepped into the void. "Victoria, you understand that once you're on the ground, we can't help you. No extraction, no resupply, no backup. You'll be completely alone until you reach the extraction point." "Understood, sir," Victoria replied, checking the altimeter that would guide her descent through 30,000 feet of darkness toward a landing zone she'd never seen in conditions that would challenge the most experienced operators. "For what it's worth," Webb added, "I think you're making the right choice. Those soldiers need someone who cares more about bringing them home than about following regulations. Someone who understands that some promises don't have expiration dates." Victoria felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she prepared to step out of the aircraft and into the thin air above Afghanistan. She was leaving behind the quiet life she'd built in Oregon, the anonymity she'd treasured, and the peace she'd found in being unremarkable. Win or lose, Victoria Castellanos, the community college security guard, would never exist again. The jump light turned green, indicating that she'd reached the drop zone. Victoria took one final breath of the aircraft's recycled air, said a quick prayer for the soldiers she was risking everything to save, and stepped into the darkness above the mountains where Alpha Squad was waiting for someone to care enough to find them. 30,000 feet below, the peaks of the Wakhan Corridor waited like teeth in the mouth of a beast, ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to challenge them alone. The fall through 30,000 feet of Afghan night sky was like descending through the layers of hell itself. Victoria's altimeter spun wildly as she plummeted through air so thin it barely registered on her instruments, her body temperature dropping rapidly despite the specialized suit designed to keep her alive at altitudes where commercial airliners cruised. The oxygen mask feeding her lungs was the only thing standing between consciousness and the kind of death that came quietly in the darkness above the world. At 20,000 feet, she could finally make out the terrain below, a landscape of peaks and valleys carved by geological forces that had no concern for human ambition or survival. The storm system that had grounded conventional aircraft was fully evident now, with winds that buffeted her descent and snow that reduced visibility to mere meters. Through her night vision equipment, the mountains looked like the broken teeth of some primordial beast, waiting to devour anyone foolish enough to challenge them. The GPS coordinates for her intended landing zone glowed softly on her heads-up display, but Victoria knew that precision was relative when falling through hurricane-force winds in complete darkness. She'd planned for a margin of error that would put her within 5 kilometers of her target, close enough to reach Alpha Squad's last known position, but far enough from potential enemy forces to avoid immediate detection. At 15,000 feet, she deployed her main parachute, feeling the violent jerk as the canopy filled with air, and transformed her controlled fall into something resembling a survivable descent. The specialized chute was designed for extreme conditions, its fabric and lines rated for temperatures that would turn conventional equipment into brittle fragments. Even so, she could feel ice forming on the rigging, adding weight and unpredictability to her approach. The landing came harder than she'd hoped, the frozen ground offering no mercy as she hit the slope at an angle that sent her tumbling down a scree field of loose rock and ice. Training took over immediately, her body going into the practiced role that distributed impact forces and protected vital equipment. When she finally came to rest against a boulder the size of a small car, Victoria lay still for a moment, conducting the mental inventory that determined whether she could continue the mission or had just become another casualty of the mountains. Everything hurt, but nothing was broken. Her equipment had survived the impact, the communications gear was functional, and her weapon systems remained secure. Most importantly, she was alive and operational in terrain that had killed better prepared expeditions. The GPS showed her position as approximately 3 kilometers from her intended landing zone, close enough to her planned route to continue the mission without major adjustments. Victoria gathered her parachute and buried it beneath a pile of rocks, eliminating evidence of her arrival that could be spotted by enemy patrols or overhead surveillance. The temperature gauge on her suit read -38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected human in minutes, but manageable with the specialized equipment she carried. The wind was gusting to nearly 60 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that pushed effective temperatures well below -60. Moving through the terrain required every skill she developed during 20 years of military service. The snow was knee-deep in places, requiring her to break trail while maintaining noise discipline that would prevent detection by enemy forces who might be monitoring the area. The altitude was affecting her breathing despite months of preparation, each step requiring conscious effort to maintain oxygen intake at levels that would support sustained activity. Alpha Squad's last known position was 15 kilometers to the northwest, across terrain that included 2 significant ridgelines and a glacier system that appeared stable on satellite imagery but could hide crevasses capable of swallowing an entire team. Victoria established a route that balanced speed with stealth, avoiding obvious approaches that enemy forces might be watching, while maintaining progress toward her objective. The first sign that she wasn't alone in the mountains came after 2 hours of movement, when her night vision equipment detected heat signatures moving across a ridgeline approximately 1 kilometer to her south. The thermal pattern suggested a patrol of 4 to 6 individuals, moving with the discipline of trained personnel rather than the random movement of local civilians. Victoria went to ground immediately, using terrain features to mask her own heat signature while observing the patrol through her rifle scope. The figures were carrying military-grade equipment and moving in tactical formation, confirming that enemy forces were actively operating in the area where Alpha Squad had disappeared. Victoria watched them for 20 minutes, noting their route, equipment, and communication patterns. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and clearly familiar with the terrain. More concerning, they appeared to be conducting a deliberate search pattern rather than routine patrol activity. After the patrol moved out of sight, Victoria adjusted her route to avoid their likely path while continuing toward Alpha Squad's position. The encounter confirmed her worst fears. Enemy forces knew that American personnel were in the area and were actively hunting them. Every step she took brought her deeper into a search zone where discovery would mean immediate contact with superior forces in terrain that offered limited escape routes. The glacier crossing proved to be the most technically challenging part of her approach. The ice was unstable, shifting constantly under the influence of wind and temperature changes that created stress fractures capable of opening into chasms without warning. Victoria roped herself to ice anchors as she moved, testing each step before committing her full weight to surfaces that might collapse at any moment. Halfway across the glacier, she found the first sign of Alpha Squad's passage, a piece of fabric caught on an ice formation, too small to be noticed by casual observation, but clearly torn from American military equipment. The fabric was frozen solid, indicating it had been there for several hours, but its position suggested that Alpha Squad had crossed this same glacier system while moving toward higher ground. Victoria collected the fabric and continued her crossing, now knowing that she was following the right trail, but also aware that if she could track Alpha Squad's movement, enemy forces with similar training could do the same. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, 7 American soldiers were running out of time while their former team leader risked everything to reach them before it was too late. The sound of gunfire echoed across the mountain peaks like thunder, sharp cracks that cut through the howling wind and told Victoria everything she needed to know about Alpha Squad's current situation. She was still 2 kilometers from their last known position when the firefight erupted. Muzzle flashes visible through her night vision scope as tracer rounds painted deadly arcs across the darkness. Someone was in serious trouble, and the volume of fire suggested they were badly outnumbered. Victoria increased her pace despite the treacherous terrain, using the sound of combat to mask her approach while calculating tactical options from the limited information available. The engagement was taking place in a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by steep ridgelines, exactly the kind of terrain where a small force could be pinned down and systematically destroyed by enemies holding the high ground. If Alpha Squad was trapped in that valley, conventional escape routes would be blocked by overlapping fields of fire. Through her rifle scope, Victoria could see the tactical situation developing with the clarity that came from years of analyzing combat situations under pressure. Alpha Squad had taken position behind a cluster of large rocks near the valley floor, their muzzle flashes revealing defensive positions that suggested they were trying to break contact rather than engage in sustained combat. The enemy forces were distributed across multiple positions on the surrounding ridges, using superior numbers and positioning to prevent Alpha Squad from maneuvering. Victoria counted at least 12 distinct firing positions, indicating enemy strength that significantly exceeded Alpha Squad's 7-person team. The tactical mathematics were brutally simple. Alpha Squad was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position where their only options were surrender or death. Unless someone changed the equation, the firefight would end with 7 American soldiers either dead or captured, moving to a position that offered both concealment and fields of fire. Victoria began engaging enemy positions with the methodical precision that had made her legendary. among special operations snipers. Her first shot eliminated a machine gun position that had been preventing Alpha Squad from moving to better cover. The second shot took out a sniper who'd been targeting anyone who showed movement below. Each shot was carefully calculated to disrupt enemy coordination while avoiding detection of her own position. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. Enemy forces that had been confidently overwhelming a trapped American units suddenly found themselves under attack from an unknown position by someone with the skills to eliminate their key personnel with surgical precision. The volume of enemy fire decreased noticeably as commanders tried to identify and neutralize the new threat while maintaining pressure on Alpha Squad. Victoria used the confusion to move closer to Alpha Squad's position, employing movement techniques that allowed her to traverse open ground without being detected by enemy observation. She reached a ridgeline that offered direct observation of Alpha Squad's defensive position and could finally see the soldiers she'd risked everything to save. Marcus Webb was clearly wounded, blood visible on his left arm as he continued directing his team's defensive fire. Sarah Martinez was treating what appeared to be a serious leg wound on James Patterson while trying to maintain her own defensive position. The rest of the team showed signs of exhaustion and stress that suggested they'd been under pressure for hours before the current engagement began. Through her communications headset, Victoria could hear Alpha Squad's radio traffic as they coordinated their defense and attempted to establish contact with higher headquarters. Their voices carried the controlled urgency of professional soldiers in serious trouble, but she could detect the underlying strain that came from knowing their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Alpha 6 to any station, Alpha 6 to any station. Webb's voice carried through the radio net. We are in contact with superior forces at grid coordinates 7-7-4-8-5-3. Request immediate air support or extraction. Multiple casualties, ammunition running low. Victoria keyed her own radio, knowing that breaking communication silence would reveal her presence, but also knowing that Alpha Squad needed to understand their tactical situation had changed. Alpha 6, this is Nomad 7. I have eyes on your position and am engaging targets of opportunity. Maintain current positions and prepare for coordinated breakout on my signal. The silence that followed her transmission was profound. Victoria could imagine the shock on Alpha Squad's faces as they heard the voice of their former team leader coming through their radios from somewhere in the darkness above them. 3 years after voting her out of Delta Force, the woman they'd rejected was now their only hope for survival. Webb's response came after several seconds, his voice carefully controlled despite what must have been overwhelming surprise. Nomad 7. Confirm your identity and position. Alpha 6, this is Master Sergeant Victoria Castellanos, conducting solo rescue operation, Victoria replied, continuing to engage enemy targets while maintaining communications. Current position ridgeline 200 meters northwest of your location. Suggest immediate movement to Rally Point Charlie on my covering fire. The tactical situation was clear to everyone involved. Alpha Squad was trapped with limited ammunition and multiple casualties, surrounded by enemy forces that had both numerical superiority and better positioning. Victoria represented their only chance of breaking out of the trap, but executing a coordinated movement under fire would require the kind of trust and teamwork that had been shattered 3 years earlier. Nomad 7, we copy your transmission. Webb replied, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that could save or doom his entire team. Standing by for your signal. Victoria checked her ammunition and prepared for the most critical phase of the engagement. In the next few minutes, she would either validate every choice she'd made over the past 20 years of service, or she would watch the soldiers she'd risked everything to save die in the snow-covered mountains of Afghanistan while enemy forces closed in from all directions. The woman who'd been voted out of Delta Force was about to prove whether their lack of confidence in her judgment had been justified or whether she remained exactly the kind of leader they needed when everything went wrong. Victoria's covering fire shattered the night as Alpha Squad moved with practiced precision toward the rally point. Despite everything that had happened between them, the team responded to her commands with the seamless coordination that had made them legendary. Years of shared training overrode personal grievances when American lives hung in the balance. Extraction took 40 minutes of running combat across terrain that would challenge Olympic athletes in perfect conditions. Victoria leapfrogged between firing positions, suppressing enemy forces while Alpha Squad carried their wounded through snow that reached their knees. When Patterson collapsed from blood loss, Webb and Martinez carried him without hesitation. When ammunition ran low, everyone shared what they had at the extraction point. As medical evacuation helicopters approached through clearing weather, Webb approached Victoria with something approaching reverence. The young teen leader who'd voted against her 3 years earlier now understood what his predecessors had known. Victoria Castellanos didn't just follow orders, she did whatever it took to bring soldiers home. "Sergeant," Webb said, extending his hand. "I owe you an apology, we all do." Victoria shook his hand firmly. "No apology necessary. You did what you thought was right then. I did what I knew was right now. That's what leadership means." As the helicopters lifted off, carrying Alpha Squad to safety and Victoria back to a world that would never again mistake her for just another security guard, she reflected on the cost of keeping promises. Some prices were worth paying, regardless of personal consequences. 3 years after being voted out, she'd proven that trust isn't about following orders perfectly. It's about showing up when people need you most, regardless of what it costs. What hidden heroes might be working quietly around you right now? Hit that subscribe button and join our community of incredible true stories. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? These stories of everyday courage happen everywhere, and we love hearing from viewers worldwide. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss these inspiring tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.